the subtle things that occur when somebody's in an interview and we feel more comfortable with one person than the second person who comes in for the interview. And so without even realizing it, we make the questions a little easier, or we listen a little bit more intently, or we give the person a second chance to answer that question. And these are things that happen every day. We're all dealing with it. And yet, when you think of the word bias, how many people associate that with something negative? Just raise your hand if you're here in the audience. Yeah. Obviously, out in our viewers' audience, I can't see your hands, but my guess is, like here, 90% of the hands would go up. Because for the most part, we have this sort of bias equals badness paradigm. One of the things we're going to talk about today is that bias is as normal to human beings as breathing. And unless we understand that, it actually handicaps our ability to deal with bias in our lives. And by the way, I say we for a reason. I'm not up here telling you that I'm somebody who's perfected this. About 2 years ago, I was down in Jackson, Mississippi, working for a couple of days with the deans and the faculty members at Jackson State University. And I had to fly from there up to New York City to be with another client. So I got to Memphis, Tennessee, time for my switchover. I got to the gate, and as soon as I get to the gate attendant comes on and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, there'll be a 45-minute delay." And the words were barely out of her mouth when a voice booms out from behind me. "You talking to us, lady?" And I turn around, and there's a guy sitting behind me who I would best describe as Santa Claus with an attitude. Older white guy, white beard, white hair, wearing overalls, a flannel shirt with a car magazine in his hand. And so I have to say I was kind of hooked. You know, I kind of chuckled to myself, got him figured out, and went about working on my computer. Time to get on the airplane. I get to my seat. Lo and behold, who's sitting next to me but Angry Santa? So we did the nod. Those of you who travel know what I mean. You get to your seat and you kind of do this, and then you take off. You go into parallel play mode. And we were like that for a couple hours, him on his magazine, me on my computer, until it became time for initial descent to New York City. Now, flyers know this is when airplane chat starts because it's now, safe to get into a conversation with somebody next to you. You're not going to get roped into a conversation with a nutcase for 2 hours, right? So I turn to him and I say, "So what takes you to New York?" And he says, "I've got a professional meeting." I say, "What do you do?" He says, "I'm a radiologist." Boom, there goes that picture, right? And then I was a little flustered and a little embarrassed, frankly, that after 30 years of doing diversity work, I'm still stereotyping people. And so I said, "Well, what kind of radiology?" And he gets really animated. He says, "Well, you'll probably be interested in this because I couldn't help but look at your PowerPoint. We're studying the brain with functional magnetic resonating imagery so that we can see which part of the brain responds when people interact with different kinds of people." In other words, he's studying the thing I'm the most interested in. And had I not pegged him as Angry Santa the car mechanic, I probably could have learned more in a 2-hour conversation than I did in 2 months of research for my book. So how many people here in the audience have had some incident like that in your lives? Fairly, yeah, all of us. And I'm sure the people out in the ether world here have the same thing. So we're going to try to break this down a little bit in the short time we have together. Bias is actually simply an automatic conscious or unconscious tendency or inclination that results in judgment without question. It's not inherently positive or negative. It can be both. Certainly we know the negative cases because we hear about these all the time. But there's sometimes when spotting something quickly can save your life. There's sometimes when it can prevent us from getting ourselves in serious trouble. It is a shortcut for us to interact with the world around us. And why do you think we have bias? Anybody here want to guess? Self-preservation. That's exactly right, self-preservation. It's our human danger detector. It's our way of spotting. If you think back thousands and thousands of years ago, when we were living in tribes, in caves, and in jungles, look out and you see a group of people around a waterhole, we had to make an instant determination whether it was them or us. And if we made the wrong determination, we might die. And this has a tendency to focus people's behavior, right? So we learn to very quickly determine who's safe and who's not safe as we move forward. But underneath this, there's a real question, which is how much of the world we're looking at do we really understand in the way we think we do? Let's take a look.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
This is an advertisement that was done on British television to make people aware of bicycle riders in London. But how many of the intelligent, observing people in this room saw more than 2 or 3 changes? Yeah, I don't see any hands up, and I'm sure out there in the audience it's the same thing. In fact, all these things are happening around us all the time, and we don't see them. This is a phenomenon the psychologists call selective attention. We see very little of what's in front of us. We see the things that are important to us, of course, or that we're used to looking for. But how many of you have been in a circumstance when you're in a meeting and something gets said that is obviously inappropriate, and you walk out and you say, "Can you believe he said that?" And the reaction is, "What? What are you talking about?" Just raise your hand if you've had that happen. Yeah. And of course, as we said earlier, the same thing happens with us. We do the same thing. We can't see everything around us. Not only that, we can't hear things in quite the way we think either. So I'm going to do a little experiment here. For folks out who are watching, and what I'd like you to suggest you do is the first time I play this video, keep your eyes closed. The second time, keep your eyes open. Folks here in the audience, what I'd like is folks on this side of the room to keep your eyes closed, and folks on this side to keep your eyes open. And I'm going to play this short 5-second video clip, and I'm going to ask you all what you hear. Okay? So close your eyes on this side, and here we go.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, so open your eyes. So if you heard ba, ba, raise your hands. So let's look around the room. So what we see here is about half the room heard ba, ba. Okay, now I'm going to play it again a second time. And, oh, by the way, over here, how many people heard something like da, da, or ga, ga? Yeah, everybody's hands up on this side. Good. I'm going to play it this time. This time you can open and close your eyes at intervals, and you can do the same thing if you're watching, and you'll actually hear a change right before your eyes. Here we go.
Ba, 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 ba.
Pretty fascinating, huh? Now, aside from being way cool, what does this teach us? We actually hear with our eyes more than we realize. Our brain makes a determination based on what we're seeing that affects our hearing. In this case, it's because even though the sound he's making is actually ba-ba, the video is of him saying ga-ga. So the brain puts together these signals. You folks heard what he actually said. Over here, our brain kind of plays tricks with us, puts it together. But this shows up in lots of other ways as well. Let's look at this brief clip from an ABC News study that shows how it might play out in a workplace environment.
He's the boss. She's bossy. The negative way women are perceived at the office in a new ad for Pantene that's gone viral. It's hit a nerve, so we set out to find the truth. Are women who act exactly the same as men seen differently? Listen to this woman. How do you feel about her as a job candidate?
I know the Windows operating systems like the back of my hand, no problem.
Now, listen to him.
I know the Windows operating systems like the back of my hand, no problem.
The candidates in these videos are actors in a Yale University hiring experiment. The resumes, identical. The interviews, identical.
I'm extremely good
at sizing up people quickly and then delegating responsibility accordingly.
The only difference is gender. But when it comes to who got the job...
I thought the male applicant had better soft skills.
I'd say the woman was arrogant and overselling.
In hundreds of evaluations, the female job seekers come off as more aggressive, are rated less likable, and they're less likely to be hired.
Isn't it a catch-22? You're supposed to be strong to get that job, and you're saying if you're too strong, you won't get it. You need to behave in this dominant way to advance as a woman in the workplace, but you're seen negatively because that's not how we expect women to behave.
And if you think this is just male bias, it's not. Both men and women doing the hiring made the same call.
I think there's a level of arrogance that becomes that might be okay to be a manager, but then there's a step above, and I thought she was slightly above that.
So let's talk. And when we revealed our study results,
I was surprised by my reaction.
What does that say about us?
We have a long way to go.
Yes, we do, don't we? And some of you have probably experienced this, men and women. You see the same behavior demonstrated by two different people, perceived completely differently depending upon who that person is. Of course, the distinction can happen around any number of differences, race, age, any number of things, as well as gender. As my good friend Sukhvinder Singh Obi, who's a brain scientist in Canada, says, our brains seem to have evolved to be good enough most of the time. Now, there's no problem with that, except that we think we're right all of the time, and that's where the confusion comes in. Now, let's put this in the context of diversity and inclusion work, because mostly we've looked at diversity and inclusion inside of an us versus them paradigm, whether it's around race or gender, and we sort of fall into place. But what we don't realize is that we're all locked into a system playing these roles that we've been trained to play. And what it creates is what I call a conversational network of contention. It's like you bring up the issue and already people emotionally and automatically begin to take sides on the issue. Very few of us have the ability to really look in a broad perspective. And so that's the background that we take around diversity. And in the early days of doing diversity, for years and years, we've mostly focused on how do we fix the problem. You know, we moved from a level of ignorance to then compliance and affirmative action and then to tolerance. You know, we have all kinds of conversations about tolerance. I don't know about you, but I've never particularly aspired just to be tolerated. But nonetheless, this is the language we use. And that kind of gets us to a particular point. It's like in the health continuum, getting to unsick. But that doesn't really mean well, does it? Getting to be not sick is not being well. But up to that point, most of the things we did for years and years were built around this whole notion of compliance and representation, making sure we follow the law, making sure we have people in the room. But that's actually just the beginning of the conversation. Once we have people in the room, we have to figure out how to really work together effectively, and that's where inclusion comes in. That's where we begin to develop better ways to manage our diversity and to develop full inclusion and cultural competency. For me, in order to do that, we have to begin to understand ourselves better. And what the research is teaching us now is that we don't think the way we think we think. We saw that just a few minutes ago when we saw the Whodunit video. So let's look a little bit at what we're learning about how we actually process the world, because we've learned more in the last 15 to 20 years than we've known in all of history up to now about how the brain works. We know that we all have an internalized book of rules. If I were to reach out and put my hand out to any one of you, you would respond by putting your hands out as well. In our culture, that's the way we greet each other. I just came back from India, and in certain parts of India, people still greet each other very differently. They might greet each other with namaste, and the handshake may be different too. In our culture, handshake needs to be like a wrestling match, or else you're considered weak. In other parts of the world, 30 or 40% of the world, a softer handshake indicates greater affinity, and that the American handshake is seen as dominating. So all of these are internal rules, and if we had more time, you could come up with hundreds of them that you've determined for yourself are the way you're supposed to be at work. These rules give us schema. Schema are framing mechanisms. They're patterns of thought that organize categories of information and the way we relate to them. So some of you have a hobby, for example. You see things different in the domain of that. My wife is a painter. When I see a picture, when she sees a picture, she sees the way the colors are melded and brush strokes and how the artist did it. I see pretty picture. So we know that this happens. The schema actually shapes what we see and what we don't. Let me show you what I mean. Take a look at this picture for a moment and see if you can identify anything recognizable in the picture. See if there's anything. People who are watching do the same. Just see if you can identify anything, and you can talk to the people who are with you and share. Anybody here recognize anything in this picture? What do you see? A cow. Great. How many people see a cow? Okay, I see about 6 people in our audience here of about 100. You're right, it is a cow. I'll make it easier for you. I'll superimpose the picture of the cow. So you should be able to see it better now. Anybody who still doesn't see the cow? Okay. Because if so, you can stick around and we can do a little remedial session later. Now I'm going to remove the superimposed picture and tell me now if you can avoid seeing the cow in the original picture. Something that was invisible a few moments ago is now right there for us to see. This is the way the brain works. Now, what would have us be sensitive to things to see around issues of identity? Do you think that people who are in the dominant group, and by that I mean the predominant cultural group, which in American society generally means white, Christian, heterosexual, male. In other cultures, of course, there are various other distinctions. Or people in the non-dominant group, who do you think would more likely see the distinctions around that group? Non-dominant, that's right. Because you have to in order to survive. If you live in a dominant culture, the rules are your rules. You're used to those rules. You're used to those things. And this is one of the things that can happen in our conversation. Somebody brings something up. I think there was gender bias there. And a man will say, what are you talking about? I didn't see anything. And the perception is that's because they don't want to see it or because they're sexist. And sometimes, of course, people are. But a lot of times it literally does not occur in our field of vision. And so when we then accuse people, they get very defensive and we're in this either or, right, wrong, button pushing thing. It's almost like a lens that gets placed on our eyes when we're younger and growing up that we don't know is there. So the world occurs in this case as blue. And we actually think the world is blue because we don't know the lens is there. We haven't stopped to look at that lens. So the schema gives us a background, and the background sort of frames everything we see and becomes self-reinforcing because we gather evidence to support that which we already know. And you all know friends who do that, right? No matter what you tell them, they'll twist it to agree with their already point of view. We don't always see it when it's the person sitting in our chair doing it, of course. You know, we see it much more likely when it's other people. And it shows up very simply. So we look at this. How many people here are roller coaster riders? Anybody, out there look the same thing? Who doesn't do roller coasters? There's also, of course, the third category, those of us who used to do roller coasters but now don't, right? We know that a roller coaster is just welded steel, bright paint, nuts and bolts, and a curved design, but some of us see fun, exciting, and exhilarating. Roller coasters are fun. Some see the opposite, scary, nauseating, or dangerous. Roller coasters are scary. And how many of you have had somebody try to talk you out of being afraid of something like a roller coaster, right? Think about how silly that is. It's as if scary does or doesn't live in a roller coaster. But in actuality, we know it's all interpretation. The same thing is true for people, of course. We see this young man, hair, earrings, glasses, and a neutral expression. Some people see well-groomed, intelligent, expressive, and stoic. Somebody else sees, one of those people, socially inept, rebellious, unfriendly, or some other variation. But we think our determination is what's so. Just like we think the roller coaster is scary, we think he is these things. And that's the challenge we have in dealing with this. How can we begin to learn more about how we make these interpretations? See, the background creates a context of things that we see, and context is everything in terms of how we process the world. So I want to talk just for a minute, don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with this, but to talk a little bit about the neurobiology behind this, because we're learning remarkable things about brain science. And so I'm going to give you a little 3-minute primer on how the brain works. We see something out there in the world, but we don't see it fresh. We see it through the lens of things we've seen before. How do we know that's a chair? Because we've seen things before that were called chair. How do we know that that's a woman or a man? The same thing. And along with that association comes any value system that we have associated with it. Good, bad, right, wrong, comfortable, friendly, safe, all of these kinds of things. We know now that the first reaction goes to what Daniel Kahneman, the great Nobel Prize winner, called the fast brain. This is in the limbic system. It's buried deep within the brain. If you look at this picture, it's in the green, roughly in the green area, buried deep within the brain. The limbic system very quickly picks things up. The amygdala spots things. It sends a message quickly to the hippocampus, which is the memory center. It says, what's that you spotted? Like going through a file cabinet. Oh, that reminds me of. And then to the hypothalamus, which is sort of like the air traffic controller of the brain, sends out a message what to do. So if I throw this at somebody, you don't want to go to your slow brain and say, oh yeah, what am I supposed to do when it gets here? Right? Your hand will shoot up before you have a chance to think about it. It takes about 0.2 milliseconds for that whole process I just described to happen. And we know that these reactions give us a sense that we're thinking, but actually it's no more thinking than when somebody presses a button on the jukebox and a song begins to play. It's a stimulus response mechanism. So for example, take a look at this picture and raise your hand if you could find the mistake in this picture. And people out there, obviously you do the same. Anybody see the mistake here? All right, somebody. Yes? What is it? Very good. Yes, the word the is repeated. Now, why didn't you see it? Remember, I didn't say look at the mistake in the numbers. I said look at the mistake in the picture. And yet we automatically go to the place that we're used to looking. And this is a good insight into how we see and especially don't see the world that we live in. So the fast brain is always reacting quickly. This is the source of a lot of our stereotypes. We've learned very quickly to identify this kind of person as safe, this kind of person as dangerous, this kind of person is smart, this kind of person is not so smart, this kind of person is dependable or trustworthy, and that one not. These are all very fast brain survival mechanisms, as we heard earlier. We also have the capability in our slow brain, the prefrontal neocortex, which is the red part here. The most remarkable part of the human brain. 2 to 3 times more active, 4 to 5 times larger per body size than any other animal. It gives us the capacity to have thoughts like, what made me think about that? Unremarkable thought for a human being, extraordinary in the animal world. If any of you have dogs and you put them out in the backyard and they see a squirrel, you notice they don't seem to say, should I chase that squirrel? Squirrel, right? We have the capacity to use it. Now let me show you how these two interact. I'm going to do a little experiment with you, and I think you'll be able to do this, those of you watching as well. I'm going to show you a series of letter combinations, and they're in different colors. I don't care about what the words are. Some of them are words, some of them are just mixed up letters. Ignore that completely. All I want you to do is to say out loud the color of the font of the word as I put it on, and you can do it as you're watching too. Here we go. Let's practice one. Very good. Okay, I'm going to go fast, so see if you can keep up. Ready, go. Sorry about that. My clicker stalled for a second. Okay, good. But you did great. Let's do it again. Let's try it again. Here we go. What happened? Do you feel that little mental tug of war? That tug of war is your slow brain and your fast brain interacting. You see, I gave you a slow brain instruction. It was very clear. You had no problem the first time. The second time, you gave yourself a fast brain instruction. It was an unconscious instruction, but it's an instruction that most of us have learned from the time we were a few years old. Letter combinations mean something. And how many of you noticed that R started before J on the first one, right? The fast brain is, you might say it's the older sibling of the slow brain. It's been around about 100 million years longer. From an evolutionary standpoint, we tend to react to fast brain. What you just experienced is what happens when we believe that we really want to treat people fairly, but we still have embedded stereotypes. That's the same tug of war that you have in your mind as to what we just saw. Just to give you a sense of comparison, if the slow brain has the capacity roughly the size of a gallon milk jug, just to give it a physicality, the rest of the brain is like the Milky Way. Hundreds of thousands of times more fast brain activity than slow brain activity. We are mostly like robots walking around here reacting to things who occasionally wake up and say, oh my goodness, I'm a robot. You know. Now, I'll give you a little hint where we're getting to at the end. When we accept that, when we can really accept that, without guilt but with responsibility, then we can do something about it. But when we think that we're seeing the world just like it is all the time, we're really flying blind. And we're going to, as I said, I'll leave you with some good news. Albert Einstein said the intuitive mind, the fast brain, is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. See, a lot of us at work worship at the altar of the rational. You sure you're being rational about that? You sure you're not being emotional? When in fact, what the science teaches us is most of our decisions are guided by the emotional. And until we're willing to embrace that and talk about it, we don't have much chance of working with it. So let me show you how this plays itself out. We've had over 1,200 studies in the last 10 years alone of the various ways that unconscious bias shows up. And I'm just going to give you a handful just to give you a sense of the scope of this. This study by a woman named Erin Reeves in Chicago, she sent out a document to law firm partners. It was a memo that intentionally had 22 spelling errors in grammar areas and technical errors in it. They were told that a young lawyer named Thomas Meyer produced the study, and alternately were told that Thomas Meyer was white or black. When they were told that he was white, he was rated 4.1 out of 5 on the memo. They found on average 10 errors, and you can see some of the comments. Has potential, good analytic skills, generally a good writer, needs to work on such and such. When they were told that the exact same memo was written by Thomas Meyer, who was black, his score dropped to 3.2, and they found 40% more errors. This Thomas Meyer needs a lot of work, is average at best, and can't believe he went to NYU. Same exact work. This one's around height. Less than 14% of American men are over 6 foot tall, but 60% of corporate CEOs. In fact, over the last 100 years, 70% of the time, the taller candidate won the U.S. presidency. Can you imagine all the pain that we would relieve for ourselves if we just line them up and choose the taller one and move on with it? An inch of height is actually worth about $800 a year in corporate America for men. Now, personally, I don't have any problem with this one, being 6'5". So, accent's another one. Researchers at Tel Aviv University and the University of Chicago found that we tend to believe people more if they have an accent similar to ours and less when it's different, with one exception. Anybody want to guess? British, that's right. We think people with British accents not only make better movie villains, but they're also smarter, right? And then finally, this one, which is one of my favorite. This comes from the National Academy of Sciences. They studied hurricanes and the fatality of hurricanes over a 60-year period, eliminating 2, Hurricanes Katrina and Audrey, because they killed so many more people it would have skewed the data. And they compared them to gender names. So they said, is there any relevance to gender name in terms of fatality? And what they found was that hurricanes named after women kill roughly twice as many people as hurricanes named after men. Now, this has nothing to do with hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. The reason the scientists at the National Academy of Sciences believe this happens is because we take hurricanes named after men more seriously and therefore prepare more for them. Think how insane that is. Think of the conversation. There's a hurricane coming. Really, what's its name? Hurricane Mary. Don't worry, it's a girl. You know, what all this points to, I could show you studies, if we had time, literally a study for every identity factor human beings have. And what we would find, and what we are discovering, is that the question is not, do we have bias? The question is, which are ours? Every human being has it, and we all know this is true. And by the way, for those of you who are in business, what do you call biases when you agree to them and even write them down? That's all qualifications are. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Qualifications are helpful. We just had a job posting in our company, 350 applications. We're not going to interview 350 people. We're not even going to take 10 minutes to read each of them. We're going to use some quick qualifications to sort them out. But we have to be careful because, for example, if we say college education, goodbye Steve Jobs, goodbye Bill Gates, goodbye Mark Zuckerberg. You know, so we have to be careful to recognize that we create these qualifications, and sometimes there are exceptions, and sometimes those exceptions come from people who've been marginalized and haven't had the same opportunities as other people have that go through the system. So a little flexibility can be helpful. As Goethe said, we see what we look for, and we look for what we know. So I want to talk about 4 key patterns of the mind and how this plays itself out. We'll talk about subliminal messaging, selective attention, which we already talked about briefly, projection, and social primacy. Let's look at subliminal messages first. We all know that we're affected by a lot of things around us. This was a study that was done by University of Toronto Medical School researchers. They took medical school interviews, which are arguably among the most competitive people will ever have, and they compared them to the weather reports on the days the interviews were conducted, and they found that students who were interviewed on rainy days received scores that were 10% lower than those who were on sunny days. Think about that. You happen to come in on a day when the weather's bad, you catch a person in a mood that was altered by the weather, tough. You get a lower score. Makes no sense, it just happens. In another study in England, they cleared the wine shelves of a grocery store, put only French and German wine, and on the Muzak played French or German Muzak with a flag up. They found that when the French stuff was up, 77% bought French wine. When the German stuff was up, 73% bought German wine. Only 14% of people said they even heard the music. And only one person in the entire study group said that they thought it affected them. So we know that things are affecting us all the time with things we see on the news and the like. Excuse the typo in that. It's so the next one is selective attention, inattentional blindness. We saw this in the Whodunit video that I showed you a few minutes ago. Here's a place where it really has an impact. Travis Drew, who is a Harvard Medical School researcher, gave people in the medical school, radiologists, this lung scan. He said, look for cancer nodes, which are very tiny, tiny things. What they didn't realize was there's something in the upper right-hand lobe of this lung. If you look carefully, you'll see that there's a gorilla superimposed in there. It's about 50 times the size of a cancer node. 83% of the radiologists didn't see it. Hard to believe, isn't it? Probably good, because you can imagine the conversation with the patient. We know what the problem is, Mrs. Jones. You've got a gorilla in your lung. Right? The third one is projection. And this one happens all the time. We see somebody, how do we know anything about that person? It's because we go back to our filing cabinet, the hippocampus we talked about, go back to that filing cabinet. What are they? Oh, looks like a man, looks like a woman, looks like this, looks like that. Along with that comes the associations that we know are a part of that. Now, we know this generally happens in 2 ways. Amy Cuddy at the Harvard Business School has done a lot of work on this along with some associates. We look for how likely we are to trust that person, how warmly do we feel towards them, or how much I can respect that person. Now, which do you think has the main priority? Likability. That's right. How much we like somebody has a bigger impact than how much we trust to respect them. We'll see this in presidential elections. People are drawn to the person who they like, who they find appealing, even if their policies aren't necessarily as aligned with them. Now, I want to do a little experiment with you here. I'm going to show you a series of slides, and you could do, for yourself, you can make a little mental note here. For those of you who have paper, you could do it on paper. I'm going to show you a series of slides just for a few seconds each, and rate the person 1 to 5 based on warmth and competence. In other words, if you really kind of like them, you give them a 4 or 5. If you don't, you give them a 1 or a 2. If they look like somebody who's kind of got their act together, then you might give them a 4 or a 5 or a 1 or 2. And these are all real people. I'll tell you who they are in just a moment, okay? So here we go. Here's person number 1. Just take a look. Warmth and competence. Okay, person number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Just first impressions. Number 5. And number 6. So here are 6 candidates. So just take a look and quickly glance. We don't have a lot of time for this, but quickly glance. Is there any pattern? Like, did you tend to rate men more positively than women, or vice versa? Were you affected by the way they were dressed or the expression on their face? Or were there any other patterns that you see in your responses? So just take a moment and look for yourself. And for those of you who are going to be together after the presentation, I know some of the people who are watching are going to probably be doing some discussion afterwards. You could talk about this then and see what you saw for yourself. These are just first impressions, right? So let's see now who these people are. This gentleman, imposing as he looks, is John Fetterman. He's the mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is an old steel town that he helped bring a huge resurgence to. He's a graduate of Harvard. He has a master's degree in public policy, served in AmeriCorps. That tattoo is his zip code. He's received international media attention for what he's done, and is, in fact, now running for Senate in the state of Pennsylvania. By the way, I understand he's almost 6'11", 300 pounds. He's a pretty imposing guy, apparently as lovable as a teddy bear. You know. This is Pratibha Patil. She was the first female president of India, also an economist and an attorney. This charming gentleman is Ted Bundy, the serial killer. But he does look likable and arguably is competent. No, but it's important to understand that they called him the gentleman rapist for a reason, and that was that he didn't pull people into alleys. He was able to go right up and seduce women into coming home with him, where he then raped and murdered them. The actual dissonance between his appearance and who he was worked at his advantage in that case. This is Mae Jemison. She was the first American female of color to be an astronaut. She's also a doctor, a professor, and now a radio personality. This is Guru Ganesha Khalsa. He's a Sikh devotional musician who's also one of the world's leading sales training experts. He makes tens of thousands of dollars a day teaching people how to sell. He also happens to be one of my best friends. He told me one time, he said, you know, my appearance is really an asset because people figure if I can sell looking like this, anybody can sell. You know? And this is Oksana Fedorova, former Miss Universe, also a Russian police captain and a fashion model, and a PhD in civil law. This is what we do. We make things up about people, don't we? Right. Oops, I'm sorry. This slide was not supposed to be there. We repeated that. But this is another one. Is this a militia initiation? No, these are 2 men getting married the first day of marriage equality in the state of Washington. This is the way the mind works. See, in the mind, in the hippocampus, we put these things together. I have the picture here of the family from Leave It to Beaver. Most everybody probably knows Leave It to Beaver in the United States. For those of you who don't, or for those from other countries, it was one of a whole slew of situation comedies that were on in the 60s, early 70s. They were all the same. Dad would go off to work in the morning with his lunchbox or briefcase, depending upon the socioeconomic status of the family. Mom would stay home and take care of the kids and do the housework. In June Cleaver's case, with pearls and high heels on, which I thought was weird even when I was a kid. And then the kids would do something mischievous, and Dad would come home and solve the family's problems. So this was the modus operandi for sitcoms back then. If we grew up in that time, then we likely have a relationship in our mind between women and housework or domestic chores. It's sort of linked in our heads. We fast forward 30 years, and here comes Jane Smith, the vice president of marketing, into the room with me. And without even thinking about it, I turn to Jane, and I say, Jane, do you know if there's any coffee here? Because at that moment, Jane Smith has become June Cleaver. This is the way the mind works. We put these things together. And by the way, not just men make this assessment. how many of the women in this room sometimes feel that pull in you, even though one part of you says, I got to let them do it for themselves. Another part of you feels almost a compulsion to be the one who gets the coffee. Just raise your hand. Yeah. Yeah, because we have that that fast brain, which is grown up thinking that this is the way I'm supposed to be, depending upon generation, of course, this is changing. And then the slow brain that says, no, I want to be treated equally. So it's not only inside of us, but outside of us as well. And by the way, it hasn't changed in the media still today. Women are far more likely, or far less likely, rather, to be seen in primetime TV roles, women over 45 especially. Men are more likely to be seen on the job and talking about the job. And even in Silicon Valley, where everybody now is talking about women in STEM, science, technology, energy, and mathematics. This is the big talk. A lot of you have read how the Silicon Valley companies are really interested in this. So HBO comes out with a new show, Silicon Valley sitcom. What's the cover story or the cover? 5 men. So this is still being reinforced today. Now, so far I've been talking to you mostly about how this shows up for individuals, but I want to quickly talk about how it shows up in group too, because we know that group influences us. Abraham Maslow created his hierarchy back in 1943. Some of you I know are familiar with it. He said there's certain needs we have to meet before other needs, and particularly physiological needs, physical needs on up the scale. It turns out now that we're finding out that he was probably wrong, that belongingness is probably our key human need. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The most vulnerable time of a human being's existence is infancy. If we don't belong to somebody, we will die. For the first couple of years of our lives, we don't get our physiological needs met unless we belong to somebody. So the first imprint on us is I exist because you exist. And this shows up in many ways in our lives. We know that the research shows that being excluded from a group triggers activity in the same regions of the brain associated with physical pain, which is why almost every time one of these horrible incidents happens, Columbine, Sandy Hook, this sort of thing, what's the first word you always hear to describe the person? Loner, almost every time, that sense of social isolation. It also contributes to the fact that 4 times as many gay teenagers commit suicide because the isolation may even be from your own family. But it also can create behavior that's just downright crazy.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before.
Yes, you laugh like you don't do the same thing, right? How many of us have gone out one night and say, I'm not going to have anything to drink tonight until everybody else orders a drink, and then, oh, well, what the heck, I'll do it. Or you're in a conversation at work and you're evaluating an employee and you feel really good about him, but before you get to speak, everybody else talks about all the problems with the employee, and then they ask you, and you're a little bit more cautious about your praise. This is the nature of who we are as human beings. We're affected by people around us. Now, I promised you I would leave you with some good news, and that is that the unconscious mind is actually malleable. The notion that we can't teach old dogs new tricks isn't even true for dogs. We've got a remarkable capacity for neuroplasticity. There's no question that when children are younger, they have more of it, but nonetheless, throughout our life, we're constantly learning new things. We've actually identified patterns, but we know that it also takes persistence. You can't expect that just by deciding one day that you're going to change that pattern, it's going to change. We have to stay committed to that and use a bunch of different strategies to help us. But I want to leave you with these 6 strategies in particular that you can use for yourself. The first is by far the most important, and that is to recognize that you have bias, yes, you, and so do I. That we all have bias. Every human being does. My family background is from Eastern Europe, and we're Jewish, and I know folks who are Jewish who rail against anti-Semitism, but then make a questionable racial comment. I know people of color who rail against racism, but then may make a questionable homophobic comment. I know LGBTQ folks who might, worry about that, but make a questionable comment about immigrants. Do you know anybody who hasn't got something going on with somebody? It's the nature of who we are. Now, I don't mean to make light of it. I'm just saying we need to realize that this is who we are as human beings. It's as automatic for us as breathing. And if we recognize that, we're far more likely to be able to be responsible for it. The metaphor I like to use is it's like the clutch in a standard transmission automobile. When you step on the clutch, and some of you have probably never driven a standard transmission automobile, but when you step on the clutch, the motor doesn't stop. The motor keeps running. It just stops moving the car forward. You see, we don't need to actually even make our biases go away as long as we learn to disengage them from our decision making. I might say, wow, I was trained to believe this about people, and I can hear that voice still going, but I'm going to put that aside as I'm getting into this conversation. That's where we make thoughtful, mindful decisions. The second, and in order to do that, is to develop a capacity to what my friend Michael Schieser calls using a flashlight on yourself. To learn to be self-observant, activate the prefrontal neocortex more, to slow down at times so that we can see, what is it about people like this that triggers me? Every time I get in this situation, I get nervous. People like this, I tend to react such and such to. The more we observe that about ourselves, the more we're aware that the lens that we're using to look at people affects our behavior towards them, the more we're going to see things like that. The third one, in order to do that, is to practice what I call constructive uncertainty. And what I mean by that is to slow down a bit. Put some question marks in where the exclamation points are. I call it constructive uncertainty because I don't mean paralysis by analysis. I don't mean stretching the decisions out forever. But often, particularly in today's world, we're rushed so much that we don't have a chance to make thoughtful decisions. And sometimes sleeping on a decision or just even bouncing it off a couple of people around you makes all the difference in the world in terms of seeing some of your biases. Rollo May, the great psychologist, said freedom is the capacity to pause between stimulus and response. Now, most of us have this. Anybody who has children, you've had those moments where you love your children, but you're ready to wring their neck because their notebook is messy again for the 19th time. And some voice comes in and says, take a breath. And you realize it's not going to do any good to scream at them, and you find a better way of interacting. That's the kind of thinking I'm talking about. The fourth one is to explore those moments of awkwardness and discomfort. You see, we live in a world in which we mostly back away from discomfort, back away from awkwardness. But sometimes that's where our greatest learning is. What's going on here? Why is this person irritating me so much? What is it about them that I'm reacting to? Even those questions can be huge. Number 5 is to engage with people you consider to be others and to expose yourself to exemplars from that group. So when you know you have stereotypes about people, to consciously go about and learn about that culture. Who are some of the people who might be stereotype breakers in that culture, who might be different? This is why things like Black History Month are still valuable to us, because they provide an alternative to the negative stereotyping we see in our culture every day around African Americans. Now, it would be a lot better if the other 11 months weren't mostly White History Month, and if we didn't choose, interestingly enough, the shortest month of the year to be Black History Month, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. But nonetheless, it's very important. So pictures on the wall in your offices, cultural expression around you, all of these things subliminally begin to reshape some of our stereotypes. And finally, the last one is to create ways to get and receive feedback. To be able to tell each other when we see things happening and to accept that feedback in a non-defensive way. Now, obviously, there are better ways and worse ways to do that. If you come up with somebody with a finger pointing and saying, that was really racist what you did, that was really sexist what you did, then you're probably going to get defensiveness. On the other hand, if you say, let me tell you, I don't know what your intention was, but let me tell you how that affected me. People are much more likely to hear that feedback. Right? Now, for those of you who are in organizations, there is good news, and that is that there are ways to systemically change some of these things. One great example, in 1970, 5% of the musicians in the major orchestras of the world were women. By 1980, it was still only 12%, even after almost 20 years of the modern women's movement. Now it's almost 40%. What happened? They installed all kinds of structures and systems, and this is the work that we can do in organizations, to put in the right kinds of structures and systems to change how we make decisions so we're more likely to systemically be pulled to be more thoughtful in our decision-making. For example, instead of simply inviting people for auditions, they began to advertise, put it in trade magazines and the like, so people could submit their own, instead of the way it used to be, which is a conductor would say, get me that second violinist from Philadelphia. The second thing they did is they moved away from having only one or two people make the decision to have panels of people. So you got lots of different opinions in, and particularly diverse opinions, so that people could see it from various perspectives. But the most important thing of all that they did was they began to have people audition behind screens and walking out on rugs, so that you couldn't hear their shoes and you couldn't see the musician at all. For fans of The Voice, this is where it came from. You know. So as a result, they were evaluating the music rather than the musician. But if we really understand what we're learning about the mind and the brain, is underneath the surface, we mostly interact with the world in very, very similar ways. And that if I grew up in your story and you grew up in mine, we would likely see the world very much the same way we do. And if we really get what that means, it means that rather than, why do you see it that way, we can shift to, wow, why do you see it that way? We can replace that fear and defensiveness with curiosity. And when we do that, we can create environments at work, at play, in hospitals, in schools, throughout our society in which everybody can thrive. Thank you all so much.